This video is going to review encoding, retrieval, and some strategies you can use to help you with both, whether you're just trying to remember something or studying for a big test. Encoding is essentially the process of getting information in, and it can be divided into two categories, automatic and effortful processing. Automatic encoding we do every day unconsciously for all sorts of different activity, and it's defined by us not being aware that we're trying to remember something. Effortful processing is when you're consciously trying to remember something, such as studying for a test, trying to learn new information. And effortful processing can be divided into visual, acoustic, and semantic processing. Visual encoding is based on the physical characteristics of whatever it is you're trying to encode. So an example would be if you're trying to remember a word, you literally look at whether it's in all capital letters, what the shape of the letters are, and the physical characteristics of the word on the page. Another strategy that can be used is visual imagery. This would be relating some other physical characteristic to the word, such as if I'm trying to remember a word that means angry, I might imagine the word in red, because red, to me, is an angry color. So I'm going to use the example of encoding the word animosity. If I was going to visually encode this word, I would look at the word on the page and notice that it's written in all capital letters on a white page in black. Furthermore, if I was going to use visual imagery, I might notice that because animosity means hatefulness or spite, it's written in sort of angry black letters with thick strokes that kind of reflect the meaning of the word. Acoustic encoding is based on the sound of a word. So in trying to encode acoustically, one might consider whether this particular word rhymes with another word or anything that has to do with the sound of the word itself. Now if I were going to acoustically encode the word animosity, I would say it out loud and just keep saying it basically until I understood what it sounded like. I would think of words that rhymed with it. There aren't that many words that rhyme with animosity, but if I was really trying to remember the definition, I guess I could think of some. Semantic encoding is based on the meaning of the word, and it's the highest level of encoding. So in encoding semantically, one might try to answer the question, would this word fit in a sentence, or does this word make sense in a certain context? In addition, one might use semantic elaboration, drawing connections between the word that you're trying to remember and other words that connect to it in some way that relates to meaning. Now I'm going to semantically encode the word animosity. So animosity ends with the suffix osity, osity, which is a state of being or state of feeling. So I know that animosity is a kind of feeling. And in addition, an tells me that it's sort of against or some kind of negative connotation. So in breaking it down, I can start to encode the meaning of the word and understand what it really means. Rehearsal is a technique commonly used in effortful processing. Through rehearsal, what was once effortful becomes automatic. In rehearsal, the spacing effect tells us that rehearsing over a longer period of time will make us more likely to remember the information. So for example, studying the night before a test won't work as well as studying for the week leading up to the test a little bit each night. So if I wanted to use rehearsal to remember that animosity is a state of feeling hatred towards somebody, then every night for a week, I'm going to write it 10 times on a piece of paper, and in addition to rehearsal, this will also use the spacing effect, which will ensure maximum retention. Now I'm just going to go over a few techniques related to rehearsal and effortful processing. The first technique is self-referent encoding, which says that if a word or concept relates to us personally, we'll be more likely to remember it. So an example would be if a word reminds me of an experience I've had, I can connect the word to that experience, and I'll be more likely to remember it easily. So here's how I can use self-referent encoding to help me remember the word animosity. I can think to myself, I feel animosity towards Shravat Chhabra because I hate him a lot, and he's a loser. And so, because I've made it relate to my life, I'll better understand what animosity really means. The next technique is mnemonic devices. Mnemonic devices are memory aids that rely on visual and organizational strategies to help a person remember something, and they come in many different forms. An example of mnemonic device is using Roy G. Biv to remember the colors of the rainbow, which are red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. Because Roy G. Biv is an easily rememberable word, it's easier than remembering the colors individually, and if you forget it, you can always just go back to it. The method of loci involves relating specific words to locations that are familiar to us and memorizing the words in the order of the location. So now I'm going to show an example of the method of loci for recalling information. And I'm going to use the example of personality disorders, psychological disorders. And I'm going to walk through my house because this is a location that I can easily visualize. And I'm going to make this room narcissistic and this room antisocial and this room schizoid and this room histrionic, and avoidant will have to be left out for now. Avoidant can be like the staircase. And so if I imagine walking through my house, which is something that I can easily do, then if I associate the disorders with the different rooms, it will be easier for me to remember what the disorders are. The pegboard system involves taking two sets of words, one that we already know and one that we're trying to remember, and literally pegging the words that we don't know onto the words that we do know. So now I'm going to show an example of using the pegboard system. First of all, I'm going to take the song called 50 Nifty, which lists the states in the United States in alphabetical order. It goes Alabama, Alaska, Arizona, Arkansas, all the way down through the 50 states. And I couldn't forget it if I tried because I've sung it so many different times for so many different things. Now I'm going to take 50, let's say I need to know 50 periodic table elements. I'm going to attach one element to each state. And then when I sing the song in the order that I know it, I'll try to attach those elements in the correct order. And this way it'll help me remember these elements. The next set of techniques are those that involve organization when one is trying to encode. Chunking is based on the idea that it's easier to recall information when we divide it up into recognizable units. So now I'm going to show an example of chunking. So if I showed you this set of letters and you had 5 seconds to memorize all of them, chances are you'll get a few, maybe a few in the beginning and the end, especially because of the serial position effect, but chances are you wouldn't get all of them. However, if I show you those same letters arranged like this, and sorry, the N is backwards, and gave you 5 seconds, you would be able to remember the 3 words much more easily because they're recognizable to you. We also use hierarchies to encode, breaking down information into varying levels of specificity. So now I'm going to do an example of hierarchies and how you can use them to help you study for a test on psychological disorders. So first of all, my first hierarchy would be that I break it down into personality disorders. From there, I could break it down into schizoid, narcissistic, borderline, avoidant, histrionic, and antisocial. Now I'm going to move on to retrieval, which is essentially the process of getting information out. And retrieval can be divided into 2 categories, recall and recognition. Recall is essentially when you're expected to generate the information yourself, and an example would be an essay test. Recognition, on the other hand, is when you are expected to find the information from amongst a list of options. So an example would be a multiple choice test, where the answer is recognizable and in front of you and you just have to be able to choose it. We rely on retrieval cues to help us retrieve information. Priming is based on the idea that we respond better or more quickly to an item if a similar item preceded it. Repetition priming is when if you've been repeating a word over and over, later it'll be easier for you to recall this word. Semantic priming is when if you've been thinking about words that are related to the word you're trying to remember, you're more likely to be able to recall that word. An example of semantic priming is if I'm trying to recall the name of this tree right there. Yeah, that one. I can't remember the name, and so I start naming other kinds of trees, elm tree, oak tree, and eventually the name maple tree comes to me, which is what that tree is, because I've listed the other trees. Now I'll move on to context effects, which are essentially when, if you're able to recreate the environment in which you encoded something, you'll be more likely to retrieve it. First up is mood congruent memory, which means that if I encode in a certain mood, then I'll be more likely to retrieve the information if I'm in the same mood. So an example of mood congruent memory is if I'm studying for a test and I'm in a really bad mood because I got in a fight with my parents, and so then the next day, if I'm also in a bad mood for a different reason, I'm more likely to recall the information. Next is state-dependent memory, which means that if you're in a certain state when you're encoding, if you're in the same state, you'll be more likely to retrieve. So this is an example of state-dependent memory, and one example that I always think of is they always tell you that you're not supposed to drink coffee right before you take a big test like the SATs, but I always do because I take coffee every morning, and so if it's 8 a.m. and I go take a test without coffee, I think the negative effects would probably outdo any good effects of not having it. So I always have coffee when I take a big test. Finally, it's important to note that some of the same devices that help us when we're encoding can help us when we retrieve. So things like mnemonic devices and pegboard and chunking and hierarchies can also be used when you're trying to retrieve information.